Okay, Barbarian Kings. So this was on my short list and has been, forever. Before I had videos of games, I had a sort of short list of games that I really liked and whatnot. And this was on there because it came from, well, first of all, it was my first fantasy war game. At a time when I was craving that idea so much. I still haven't found much, if anything, that really satisfies me there. The closest that comes that I've seen is Scandinavia. Although some things, like the more modern Fantasy Flight War of the Ring, is kind of, maybe put out by other people now, whatever, is kind of up there in terms of kind of cool and everything. But it's got a risk-like combat system that I really am not that excited by. But this one, filled that gap for me in terms of I had gotten into war games, then I got into role-playing, into D&D specifically, although I may have already branched out by the point I got this. I'm not sure. And then, I doubt it, but maybe. And then, I picked this up at SPI headquarters, if I recall correctly, and I was so excited to see something that was like trying to deal with fantasy topics in a war game type rules set and that kind of rigidity and everything, where I wasn't just playing let's roll up a random dungeon and wander around or something along those lines, and it wasn't a minis battle either. I had minis battle systems that I never had enough minis. I had a lot of minis. I never had enough that were similar enough to build stands of units and whatnot. And plus, they were all 25 millimeter, which, but they were all painted from my role playing. But when I start to think back, I don't think this was just nostalgia that's speaking. I think, like a couple of other games, and one that comes particularly in mind that reminds me of this, although not as bad, was Kingmaker. Where, okay, at least with Kingmaker, I think I enjoyed myself playing it solo a fair amount of times. But every time I brought it opposed, it ended up this tedious slog that just didn't work out and wasn't anywhere near as much fun as I had hoped it would be. But this one I don't think even worked for me solo. I think what happened was I would play it with the non-plotted movement more often than not when I played solo, and would say, this would be a much better game if I could play with plotted movement. And I didn't have diplomacy yet. I fiddled around with Machiavelli solo at times, although that was at a later date. And I just have this feeling that I put expectations on the game as an opposed game, and then when I brought it to opposed settings, I know it always fell incredibly flat. I can recall the couple of times that I managed to get people to play it, and it was just not a lot of fun. And looking at it now with sort of a critical eye and paying attention to, critiquing games as opposed to just playing it and then saying, well, that wasn't as much fun as I remember, putting it aside and then forgetting. Instead, I've started looking at, geez, what is it that's making it so bad? And there's a lot. There's a lot. First of all, the first thing is, right at the beginning of the game, you pick 3 skills for your king. The skills are magic. And when it comes down to it, most of them are crap. Magic really sucks. It's very weak. It's very unlikely to work. Mind control might get you a bunch of troops and give you a jump at the beginning of the game, if you get lucky, right? And you have to set aside money to grab those troops. And it's not the troops you're interested in, it's the territory they're sitting in it can kickstart your income and get you all kind of great stuff that way. Most of the other magic is pretty damn iffy. First of all your magic starts out only working on a 1 or a 2. And it can very easily go down to only working on a 1 if you roll a 6. Some of the magic can be more powerful than others. So, like I said, mind control can get you a jump at the beginning of the game. You can use it for some kind of powerful effects in the during play. Elemental magic, you can do some cute stuff with it in terms of preventing people from moving certain places. What else do we have? We have illusionary magic I almost never use because it's just a fucking pain in the ass, no matter how you look at it, even in an opposed game. It causes issues. Because you have to track the illusory units differently than you track your normal units. You don't pay income for it. If somebody wants to build those units, your units disappear. Just all kind of shit that, feels like an obnoxious set of rules around it. So I think when I brought it to opposed play, I usually told people, let's just not play with illusory magic. It's not that big an advantage. It's not that powerful. It's not like those units fight for you. They disappear when they go into combat, and I'm not even sure they can block. So all they're really doing is kind of providing you with like this weirdness where you look like you have stronger forces than you actually do, but chances are other people want to buy those units, and therefore you're never going to get to use them. Invisibility is kind of neat. You can slip through stuff, but again, you can slip through stuff by using the vagaries of the movement system. Necromancy, you can kill leaders or units. It's really expensive to do. And then the other thing is you can raise units. And it's really dangerous to do that because the zombies you try to raise might eat your army instead. So, I consider all the magic kind of weak. Then what do you have? You have 3 non-magical abilities. One is retreat, which is really, really fucking useless. And the only person who took 2 levels of something took 2 levels of retreat in the game that I just played, which is just horrible. Basically, it allows you to control your opponent's retreat, which can be it's not like these are totally useless. It's just they're outshined by one particular skill that everybody should take 3 levels of with their king, and probably without any real thought. So there's some cute stuff you can do retreating an opponent, and if you have 2 levels of retreat more than your opponent, you can the opponent you're fighting against, which only a king can have, you can choose never to retreat, which means if you hold an area and you lose combat, there's a good chance, except if you're eliminated, that, unless you're eliminated, you will stay in control of the province, which means you can get the income from it and you can build troops in it, no matter whether there's enemy forces that are remaining in there or not. So that's kind of cool and all. Again, all of these capabilities feel kind of neat. But the next one that I believe is the second most powerful is March. This allows one of your heroes or your king to move an extra movement space. This can be really, really potent, especially very early in the game when you're doing kind of a land grab, so that you can get more income. Same kind of thing as the mind magic, except you can do this without any risk, really. Like, there's no chance of failure or anything like that. But they all pale compared to tactical ability. And the reason for that is tactical ability, each level of tactical ability you have gives you a combat shift on the simple combat table. Now, that need not be a huge deal, but the combat table is one of the most devastating flaws in this game. basically, the way the combat system works is the larger force, you always take your odds, larger force to smaller force, which means you're not like in most war games looking at, hey, is the attacker, does the attacker have between 1-to-1 and 2-to-1 odds, or are they above 2-to-1, stuff like that, which gives it an edge to the defender. Instead, what it means is almost always you're going to be looking at 1-to-1 odds. Now, you probably wouldn't attack if you were below 1-to-1 odds, with the way the charts are anyway. But now, in order for you to be facing a really ugly odds table as the attacker, the defender would have to have twice as many strength points as you do. Now, there's terrain that affects your strength points and everything, but almost every important battle in the game is going to be resolved on the 1-to-1 table. Okay, well, that sounds like it's going to be kind of dull if you think about the normal SPI 1-to-1 table. Except it's not the normal SPI table, it's closer to the Avalon Hill tables. It has an eliminated for both sides, a half eliminated for both sides, no exchange or anything like that, and then 2 retreat option requirements. Which means that the vast majority of the important battles in the game, probably almost every single one, are going to be fought on a table in which you have an equal chance of being destroyed as your opponent. The combat table really needs to be modified in this game to make it a more interesting game. Otherwise, hey, look, I have 15 strength points and you have 28. I'm going to attack you because I have a 1 in 6 chance of destroying your army and you have a 1 in 6 chance of destroying mine, and that doesn't sound fair, but that's cool. And if I have like a tactical advantage on you, oh look, I'm on the 2-to-1 table attacking you. It really ends up very ugly. Now, in the sample playing I did, nobody had more than 1 level of tactical. I think that's a mistake. I think almost every leader, every king in the game should have 3 levels of tactical. It's an advantage you do not want to give up, and somebody's running around out there. I think it's a squirrel. It might be a bird. It's got to be a squirrel. I heard claws. So that's one of the huge flaws in the game. Another one has to do with the way movement itself is handled. You have this plotted movement. Now, if you think about other plotted movement games, if you think about your diplomacy, Machiavelli, Le Glaive, they all have use sort of the diplomacy mechanism, which is like, I have to build this strategy, I'm moving a piece into somewhere, but another piece can grant support and stuff like that. And that all works and can be explained in a couple of paragraphs, although the consequences of that explanation might require a lot of thought for you to get there. Now, for this system, it's not equal-sized units like on a diplomacy board with, you being able to figure out, well, do I push somebody away, do I not? Instead, what this is big stacks of units with strength points. And there's a hint at... So the rules are not complete. They don't tell you everything that they appear to imply. So there's this concept of blocking, which is never fully spelled out, where... it seems to be, and otherwise illusionary units wouldn't make much difference, it seems to be the fact that, or invisible units wouldn't make a difference, that if you move into an area with an enemy force, the enemy force can declare that you're being blocked, and then you can't continue your movement. That's how I read the rules. You could also read them that there's no such thing as blocking. The only thing there is something that is explicitly handled, which is if you're in an area, if you start a move in an area controlled by the opponent, you cannot move into another area that you don't control. That would be an alternative reading of it, and that might actually solve this problem. So maybe I'm reading the rules wrong, but if that's the case, they're talking about this blocking functionality, and all they mean is that. It never spells out what they mean by blocking, and they seem to be two separate concepts. So the way I read the blocking, if you end up, if you and an opponent are next to each other, and this would happen in either case, say here and here, and your opponent rights to move into your space and you right to move into theirs, you just pass each other by and nobody blocks each other. And that feels a little funky. With the other rules, I don't know if it'll still do the same thing. You'll still have the same thing where you pass each other by. And that's not usual for point-to-point or area movement games. Usually something happens where one force gets pushed back, or maybe they both fail to go in a diplomacy situation. But what ends up happening in this game is they just pass each other by, and as long as no one else is moving into those spaces, control just switches. So you lose control of the area you had to your opponent, and they lose control of the area they had to you. And it's very unsatisfying in a lot of ways. It's like, yeah, something else needed to be written here. So let me think what else we have. The areas that you can start the game with are also somewhat unbalanced. I don't know how much I kind of like this concept, which is that areas have an income value, which is very, very important, because it's hard to keep your armies in the field. Like, you're almost, because big stack of units seems like a huge advantage, and you want to make sure you don't fall below 1-to-1, and you're hoping you can maybe squeeze into a 2-to-1 odds against someone. Big stacks of powerful units is an important factor in the game, but they're expensive, and they cost to maintain, and it's quite possible that you're running up close to your maintenance cost every turn. Especially since at the beginning of the game there's a lot of territory to take, and you can increase your income very quickly, but then it feels like you want to keep increasing, right? And so you build up, you start with a powerful army, and you move it to grab as much territory as you can get. But anyway, the costs of the values of the provinces are not necessarily in alignment with the types of troops you can build in the province. And in some cases, there are provinces with a very high value. For example, the Orcish province, which also have very cheap and crappy troops present in them. Which means that you don't really need that money to build your orcs, and those orcs aren't a really powerful force to use in combat either. Now, on the other side, there are places that are like civilized areas that have like a 4 income and don't give you enough money to produce anything anywhere. However, they'll add to your total income, and you can mobilize your total income in one of those spaces and gather larger troops. So there's this interesting balance, and this is actually one of the things I think is cool about the game, but I don't think it's terribly well balanced, of provinces that you want to take versus provinces you don't want to take as starting provinces. In the 3-player game, you're allowed 2 provinces each. In the 2-player game, you're allowed 3 each. In the 4 and 5-player game, you're only supposed to have 1 province each. There are some if you're playing, I think anything up to 3 players is fine. If you're playing 4 or 5 players, there are certain single provinces that have good income and good troops. Notably, the civilized 10.1 is really good. There's an Elvish 8 and a Dwarvish 8, both very good. And then all the provinces become significantly less valuable. So there's 3 provinces that are pretty damn good, and then the other 2 players are going to have lesser provinces. There is another civilized province worth 8. It wouldn't be a bad choice, except someone else has the one worth 10. And you're limited by countermix, and we'll get to that in a moment, but that can mean you have no troops at the beginning of the game. The way the rules were written. I played it a little differently. Like I said, you're going to have to find the tweak. Basically, I think there might be a good game underneath here that hasn't been developed, right? Or maybe somebody has, and I'm just not aware of it. Because I didn't really look around for, hey, how do you want to fix this thing? There are then a bunch of provinces that are significantly less value, that have decent troops, and then there's one more 8-point area that has a single very good ship that starts in it, and that's it, a pirate ship. It doesn't feel like your starting options in the 4 and 5 player game are equal for the different players. There might be ways around it, I don't know. But I haven't been able to consider any. And then there's provinces with cool shit, and the cool shit just doesn't come into play. Which is a pity, because there's neat things like the airships and stuff that I almost never see anybody manage to use effectively. They're very, very expensive, not terribly strong. Well, they're okay strength-wise. But they have good movement. They have really, really neat movement. But the thing is, the game devolves into huge stacks of units smacking into each other, trying to see if somebody can beat that 1-to-1 odds ratio. Now, it's not just the airmen who get slighted by this for their cool movement. It's also everything that has cool movement. And a lot of the different units do, but probably the highest, the most likely type of unit that sucks to buy because of this generally is cavalry. The cav tends to cost more, usually has the same strength value as infantry does, although for some reason Elvish cavalry is really, really potent, and is a good cost to force ratio. But for the most part, you're paying significantly more for your cav. And oddly enough, the feudals don't have any cav, but I don't know what's up with that. But the barbarians do, and yeah, sure, that's fine. I don't know. And the civilized have really good, expensive cav. I just don't know. But what ends up, what ends up happening is you buy cav not because you want that extra movement that it has, which is its only really special thing in the game, although it also has some terrain disadvantages. It doesn't provide any other cool effects to it. But because the counter mix is limited, those are the only troops that you can build. So you get forced into that. And that was what I wanted to go into. If 2 people, for one reason or another, pick the same nationality, race, whatever you want to call it, type of territory, and the only thing that's really likely, well, that's possible to happen in a couple different types. It could happen in elves, it could happen in dwarves, but the place it's most likely to happen is in the civilized, where there's a 10-point area and an 8-point area. Civilized troops are good. The way the game is written, you're supposed to simply dice off, and one person gets to buy all them troops. Now, you start with a big wad of cash at the beginning of the game, $50. I don't know if it's enough to buy all the civilized troops, but it's enough to buy all the infantry and boats. And force your opponent, who also probably picked after you, with a civilized area, force them to take all the cavalry, which is very, very expensive. It's kind of strong, but it's not a great deal. Are there other better choices? Maybe. You might see somebody look at that and say, wow, that's a shitty thing. I guess I'll take the second 6-point area for the elves or dwarves. Well, for the dwarves, I believe one person can buy them all. So whoever wins the die roll gets them all in that case. And it's not just like the guy who took the shittier space. The shittier space is screwed. It's up to a die roll. One person is good. One person is fucked. By taking the same race. Now, civilized, elf, dwarf. That's 3 that are good. Orc. If you're playing in a 1 province per player, 4 or 5 player game by the rules, taking the orcs is pretty shitty. You're within striking range of both the best dwarven and best elven space, and you will probably get your ass handed to you. So that's not a great option either. Now, I played it with 2 provinces each with 5 players, and I think that helps a little bit, but it still makes it possible for someone to lock out the other person's main culture, main troop supply. Like, let's say I take, as somebody did, the orcs and one of the civilized spaces. Well, if I lose the die roll on the civilized spaces, I'm back in the same position I was in before, where all I have is the shitty orcs. And that would be pretty bad. Or I'm back in the situation where all I can do is buy the expensive civilized pieces, the cavalry, and screw it with the orcs, and I'm going to lose that province. And it comes to a die roll at the very beginning of the game as to, and every time that people want to buy units. So some other mechanism for purchasing units, especially at the very beginning of the game, probably should be devised. I came up with one. There are other choices there. Trying to think what else I got here. Take a look at the sequence of play. My game is falling apart. And see if there's anything else that really... No, I can't think of anything else. I thought there was another facet I wanted to talk about, but I may have covered it and just lost my count. One of the complaints people have about the game is the amount of record keeping in it, and it is abysmal for the size of game it is. You basically have to track the skills of your leaders, all the provinces that you own, your cash on hand, all the units that you own, and then you have to plot where each leader is moving and what units he's carrying with him as he's moving. That's by the rules as they're written. What I found was a few little control markers and maybe a little bit of fuzzing around with being able to drop strength points off in the midst of your move without having plotted it. Give a kind of nice situation where honestly you don't need anywhere near as much effort to put in to the bookkeeping and plotting. In that case, you need to track. What I found is what you really need to track is the leaders that you have. You have tokens on the board for the provinces that you own. You have to track your treasury. You don't really have to track the troops that you have, because they will either be stacked with a leader that you control or in a province that you control, except for in a couple of really, really unlikely situations, in which case you could put a control marker on top of them. So overall, the way I look at this is something that never really lived up to the expectations I had for it, but somehow I remembered it more by the expectations than by the reality that it ever served. And it's not the only old game that I feel that way about. I do think that there is room that somebody could redesign, develop this. From what I understand, the Jolly Rogers version made changes, but people seem to be very negative on them as though they made the game worse. There's so much wrong with the original that I don't know how much worse they could have made it, but it's quite possible that they did. So I don't know. I know they were talking about something having to do with stickers and stuff, and it's got wooden pieces and everything, and I'm just like, whoa, this ain't Barbarian Kings, man. What's up with this? But whatever. This version feels incredibly flawed. I had always rated it kind of well. Maybe because I used the non-plotted movement and that it worked out better, and then I made up rules as I went when I soloed it. And it felt like, I'm close to something that's working. Just like I felt like I was close to something that was working here. But I don't think it's ever really brought much joy. And I think if you were going to bring this to play opposed with people, you'd really want to nail those rules down. You'd want to do the development work that wasn't done on the game itself before you do that. Anyway, that's all I got here. I'm sad to say this feels like much more of a stinker than I thought of it as, and I kind of wish I hadn't played it, because it was a game I liked, as long as I wasn't too aware of what it was like. Oh well.